Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 6th Deaf Hub Exploring Perspectives lecture series presentation today. Thank you so much for coming today. This is our first time in Ingle, but hopefully not our last. For today, we have a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Rochester. She received her Ph.D. in pathology. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Sara Blick-Nitko.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here today. Thank you for coming to my presentation. So, just to start my presentation, I always like to show this graphic. This is very true. I cannot explain how true it is. When I started my journey in undergrad, graduate school to PhD, I did compare my journey to other people. I thought I would have the similar path, a direct line from point A to point B. This will happen, then that will happen, then I will be a doctor. I believed that would happen, but I had a lot of struggles along the way. And the journey was not easy, nor was it linear. It was really more the right half of this graphic. My name is Sara. This is my sign name. I want to talk about these 4 aspects while I provide my presentation today. I'm going to talk more specifically about research and science that I've done over the years. I'm not going to explain in depth that science, but I'm going to show you examples of the science that I've done to explain that it's okay to get out of your comfort zone, try something different. You never know what you're going to fall in love with until you try it. So I did a lot of science research in different fields, different areas, and I learned a lot, and I gained a lot of experience and skill in those different fields. So, in order to explain my journey, I feel like you have to know who I am, and to do that, we have to start at the beginning. So, I'm going to briefly touch on my youth, my educational background, how I decided to prepare and apply for PhD programs. And so for some of you who are wanting to apply to PhD programs, I'm going to share some tips. Hopefully it'll help you in your processes. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the obstacles that I faced along the path to my PhD and how those obstacles led me to do the advocacy work that I do today. I was the first deaf person born in my family. My parents didn't know I was deaf until I was 1.5 years old. When they discovered that I was deaf, they searched for a deaf program. We didn't have a residential school near my hometown. They didn't want to send me a great distance to a residential school to just come home on the weekends. So they found a school about 30 minutes away. It had a BOCES Deaf Ed program. So I went there starting at 1.5 years. That was in Altamont Elementary School. Oh, I should tell you, I'm from Scotia. It's a small town in New York near Albany. It's about 3 hours away from here. So I attended Altamont for preschool and elementary school. I learned sign. I worked with teachers of the deaf who knew sign. And then it was time to go to elementary school, and that was in Westmere Elementary School. I was mainstreamed at that point for most of the day, so I started learning how to work with interpreters. And I've worked with interpreters since I was 2. So I grew up like everybody does. I attended middle school at Farnsworth Middle School. So preschool to 8th grade, I had a half-an-hour commute there and back. So it was a full hour of commute. My older brother, who is hearing, went to school who was right near my house. It was like 3 blocks away. He had a lot of friends in the area. He walked to school with his friends, and I wanted the same experience. I didn't have a great experience in middle school. So I thought, you know what, I'm ready for something new. I talked with my folks, and they allowed me to transfer to my Scotia Glenville High School, middle school, near home. So when I got into high school, I had 1 interpreter for all 4 years of high school. And I didn't know what that was called until I went to college. But looking back, I realized I had a designated interpreter. The same interpreter was with me for 4 whole years. They knew my personality, they knew my interests, they helped me socialize with other people. So that was my experience in high school. I was the only deaf person in my high school. So I was very immersed in the hearing world for a long time. I didn't understand my own deaf identity until I started college. So that is my growing up experience. So you might be wondering how I got into the science field. I'll let you know that I failed my environmental science regents. It was required to take 2 science regents exams to get your regents diploma at that time. And I did pass biology the year prior. So I failed this exam. I went ahead and took it again. I failed it again. And I was not crazy about environmental science, to be honest. And the school let me know, like, you have to take this class again if you want a regent's diploma. There was no way I wanted to do this. I had reached my limits with environmental science. I wasn't doing it again. So the school gave me another option. They said, well, you could take chemistry. And they warned me, this is a really hard class. And I should also mention, I was the only second deaf person to go to that high school in history. The last time a deaf person was there was 20 years prior to me, maybe 15 years prior. So I really had to deal with navigating autism and working with hearing people and advocating for my own needs and accommodations that I needed during high school to show these hearing people that deaf people are very capable. So I decided that I would take chemistry for a year. At the same year, I decided, it was my junior year, I decided to take an entrepreneurship class. I knew I wanted to go to college, and I thought I wanted to major in business, so I thought that was a great idea. I would get college credit while in high school, so at the same time, I took entrepreneurship and chemistry. It just so happens that entrepreneurship and business really wasn't the thing for me. I fell out of love with it, and I fell in love with chemistry. My chemistry teacher in high school was fantastic, and that sparked a passion for science. So when I entered NTID, I was accepted into the laboratory science technology program. I never forget, when I came to RIT, I was shocked. I realized that being deaf was a thing. I was not the only deaf person in the world, and I'm very grateful to RIT for giving me that experience in a deaf community. So my undergraduate education was a lab science technology degree. There was an associate's that required a co-op or an internship, if you will. I wanted to stay home in Scotia for the summer, so I found a job 5 minutes away at the Pace Analytical Life Sciences company. I needed an interpreter. I told them this, and they denied me that. They said, no, we're not going to give you an interpreter. We want to see how you work without an interpreter. And I had no idea. I was young. I was still learning about my rights, my deaf identity. I was still learning about the ADA as a deaf person. So I accepted the position because I wanted that job, and I went ahead and I interviewed with 2 men without an interpreter. And of course, they had mustaches and beards. It was very hard to understand their speech. It was very awkward, super awkward interview. We opened a laptop. We typed back and forth. The older gentleman didn't type all that quickly. And I thought after that, there was no way I was going to get that job. The next day, they offered me the co-op position. I worked there for a summer, and I enjoyed myself. My boss learned some sign. We were able to communicate. I had a great boss. So I graduated from the LST program. I transferred to the Bachelor's in Biomedical Sciences, and I went back to that PACE lab for the next 2 summers. I was testing water quality, so essentially it was environmental science that I was doing, but I enjoyed that part of environmental science. I want to emphasize that while I was working toward my biomedical sciences degree, I was still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. I knew that RIT provided a lot of different options and electives, so I took advantage of all of those experiences that I could get via coursework. I took nutrition, endocrinology. I took sports kinesiology, infectious disease courses, immunology, just to figure out what I wanted to do. So I found that I was interested in infectious diseases and immunology. I started considering a PhD program while I was getting my bachelor's degree, but I realized I didn't have enough lab research experience, and that is critical if you want to study for your PhD. So I decided I would go ahead and apply for graduate school at RIT, and I would also enroll in the Bridges to the Doctorate program. That provides you with a lot of research experience you need in order for you to get into a PhD program. Also, I tried new things. I first applied for a master's degree in bioinformatics. The first week of classes, I realized, nope, this is not a good fit. This is not going to do it for me. And I decided to change my major to professional studies under the School of Individual Studies. I focused on biology, health systems administration, and bioinformatics was a part of the studies, but I didn't have to do the computer programming, which I did not enjoy. Working in the Bridges to the Doctorate program really helped me get my foot in the door with research. I did 2 lab rotations via the Bridges program at the University of Rochester, and I had University of Rochester interpreters working with me during those experiences. I worked with Dr. P.J. Simpson-Hadaris in her lab, and we did breast cancer metastasis research. I learned so much from P.J. I consider her a wonderful mentor, and we're still in contact today. P.J. taught me a lot about tissue culture with cells, and she really supported me growing as a scientist and in my journey. I'm very thankful for her mentorship and her teaching. I worked with her for a year, and then I worked in Dr. Craig Morell's lab, and we were studying the role of platelet factor 4 in B-cell differentiation. That research rotation kept me busy for a whole year, and I got my first publication as a result of that experience. So this was the same time that I started applications to PhD programs. Whew. It's tough to summarize 6 years of experience in 1 hour, but I'm going to try my best. I want you to know if you're considering a PhD studies, you have to understand what it means to get a PhD. Programs are very difficult. They're very taxing on your mental health, your physical health, and your emotional health. You have to be invested to do this. It's a huge long-term commitment. I want to make sure that you get into it for the right reasons. If you have a specific job in mind, research those jobs. Do you really need a PhD to take on those roles? And think about the potential careers you can attain with PhD studies, and if you definitely need it. So I knew I wanted to continue with school. I had a lot of dreams at that point, and most of them did require a PhD. You have to think about the location where you want to live while you're studying for your PhD. I could go on for hours on each of these topics, but I'm going to mention just briefly some information. Think about the location where you want to live. Think about the weather there. Do you like cold weather? Do you want to be hot? Do you want to be in a place that has 4 seasons? That's going to impact your health. That's going to impact your ability to take advantage of outdoor activities, if that's something that you love. As a deaf person, I knew I wanted to be connected to a deaf community. So I wanted to apply to PhD programs in locations that had healthy deaf communities. Think about the professional and personal environment and how your personality and your needs fit into that. Accessibility is key. That was a huge factor in my decisions when I applied for PhD programs. I did a lot of research about what accessibility the school had, what they could offer, and so how it could support me throughout my journey. And if they weren't accessible, how would they deal with that? How would I identify allies who could help me in those processes? Talk with other deaf people who have been in those PhD programs before. Talk about their experience. The community does relate to environment. So think also about the kind of research you want to do. This was something that I did not put a lot of emphasis on. I wanted to explore different research areas, and I was willing to be flexible. Some people are born with a goal in mind, and they keep that specific goal in that research area forever, and that is okay. But I wasn't one of those individuals. I knew I wanted to think about different research areas, and I believe for me, my priority was the mentor, not so much the research topic. I wanted to be in a healthy environment with support from a seasoned mentor, and I was more open to the type of research I would be willing to do. Workflow is hugely important to consider. What kind of work do you like? Do you like wet labs, meaning you're going to be sitting at a bench working with chemicals? Or do you like a dry lab, working with computers and data analysis? Big bioinformatic data sets, is that your thing? Are you interested in coding? So there's a lot of things to consider when you're thinking about the different parts of research. Working in a wet lab is more of my preference. I can work with cells, I can work with animals, I can work with molecules and models. Some people don't want to work with animals, so you have to know where your priorities lie and where your preferences for research lie. Work-life balance is also a critical thing to consider. PhD studies are very difficult. They're very taxing. You have to make sure that you can take care of yourself in other ways outside of the PhD work. There's a lot more things to think about, and I'm open to you contacting me if you want to talk about different reasons and points and tips.
So I decided to apply to 7 different PhD programs around the United States. And I got offers. I was automatically accepted to the University of Buffalo. I didn't have to go for an interview or anything like that. I was just given the acceptance. And then I was invited for interviews at the University of Arizona and the University of Rochester. And I want to briefly share a story about my interview experience at the University of Arizona. So I went to the University of Arizona first for their interview weekend. And when I applied for the PhD program, I knew that I wanted to be close to a good support system. So my husband's family actually lives in Arizona, so that's part of the reason why I applied there. I knew that they had a small deaf community, but that it was a strong deaf community, so I thought that would be okay. So I went to visit the University of Arizona for their interview weekend. I met the interpreters, and I found out that none of the interpreters had any experience in PhD level science programs. There was one student in a mathematics PhD who's actually graduating soon, but I realized that I would be the only person at the University of Arizona who was deaf in a PhD program related to science. Despite that, I had a great interview weekend. I met several faculty and students. It's very important when you do interviews that you check whether the faculty and students seem happy. Does it seem like a positive place? If they don't seem happy, then you may want to reconsider and do some more research on why that's happening. So you want to check on the environment while you're there. So in the first faculty interview, I was extremely nervous. It was my very first PhD interview at all. And I did have a chance to meet with the interpreter beforehand. I explained my research, I explained, my areas of research, my areas of interest, my knowledge, and tried to give them as much background information as I could in a short amount of time. So I went into the interview, and I was talking about my research on the role of fibrinogen in breast cancer metastasis. And I was explaining it to the faculty who I was meeting with, talking about my research, and the faculty suddenly paused right in the middle of the interview and paused and said to the interpreter, "You're pronouncing this word wrong." I know that Sarah is pronouncing it right. They were able to read my lips and they saw that I was saying the right word, but the interpreter was saying the wrong word. And I didn't even realize. I had no idea that was happening. And it really threw me off. But overall, that entire weekend was great. I got to tour the labs. I saw that the PhD students were very happy. And University of Arizona has the philosophy that they want their graduate students to be happy, because if they're happy, then they'll be more excited about doing their research, they'll be running more experiments, they'll be more productive, they'll be gathering more data, and so they really value that work-life balance. And I really appreciated that. So that was my interview weekend at the University of Arizona, and then I went to the interview weekend at the University of Rochester after that. I felt a lot more confident at that point about my interview skills, and I had the same interpreter who had been working with me for 2 years during my master's research at the University of Rochester. So we already had a relationship, they knew my work very well, and that helped me feel a lot more confident. Now, the program that I applied for, Pathology, is studying disease development, and it includes many different areas of science. So it's really more of a multidisciplinary type of program, meaning that it includes areas of different expertise outside of the program. So when I went to the interview weekend at the U of R, there were also other programs doing their interview weekends. There was one for immunology that was happening at the same time. And I really wanted to interview some of the faculty in the immunology program, but unfortunately they weren't available because they were doing their own interviews. So I mostly interviewed with people in the musculoskeletal department, and I know nothing about that, musculoskeletal systems. So I was not very confident about my interviews. I didn't really understand the faculty's work that were interviewing me. They didn't understand my work. It just wasn't a great fit, and so it didn't feel great that weekend. But I was in a very familiar environment. So I ended up deciding to go to the U of R. And I felt more comfortable with that decision because there were other deaf students doing research there at a PhD level. I knew I had a support system. I had been living in Rochester. I knew I had a strong community here. I had already been working with this pool of interpreters at U of R who were able to continue working with me through my PhD too. So as a first-year PhD student at the University of Rochester, and for anyone, I really want to emphasize how important the lab rotations are for several different reasons. So first of all, lab rotations is an opportunity for you to see and understand research in different labs and see whether you enjoy doing that type of research. But it's also an opportunity to develop relationships with mentors and advisors in those labs. You want to see what the environment is like in the labs, and you also want to see the other people working with you in the lab and how well you get along with all of them. Some labs, you'll be working in the lab for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of your life, and so it's really important that you're comfortable working in that environment and with the people in that environment. I did 3 lab rotations. One of them was focused on researching influenza, and I wasn't sure if I liked virology, but I wanted to go ahead and give it a try just to see. And I realized that I didn't really enjoy that type of research so much, but I did really enjoy the people in the lab. Most of them were Spanish-speaking people, and so I really enjoyed sort of the different cultures and sharing, that multicultural environment. Everyone was very warm and welcoming, but at the same time, the accents were sort of difficult to manage for the interpreters and for myself. So it wasn't a great fit, but I still really enjoyed my time in that lab. The second lab rotation I did was with Dr. Michael Rusty in his lab, and he studied macrophages. So those are cells. They are like the Pac-Man cells of our immune system. So they clean up any foreign debris, they clean up dead cells, they really clean up our blood system. And their lab was very flexible. Several of them decided to learn sign language. They picked up ASL really quickly. I felt very comfortable working with them. I could easily learn what I needed to do. I really enjoyed the lab workflow, and so I kept that lab in mind as a future potential PhD program lab for my dissertation. And then my third one was with Dr. Laura Calvis. She also studied macrophages, but she studied macrophages in bone marrow environments. And when I worked in her lab, there weren't a lot of people around, and I realized that I didn't really like working with bones. That wasn't for me, so I realized that wasn't a good fit. But I remembered during my master's in the Bridges program, I did a lab rotation with Dr. Craig Morrell, and I really enjoyed working in his lab. So I asked him if he had funding to be able to accept a PhD student to do my dissertation research with him. And unfortunately, at that time, he didn't have funding to be able to do that. So I decided to meet with Rusty. That was the second lab rotation I did on macrophages in my PhD program first year. And I want to mention that it's important to have a conversation with the PI of the lab that you're considering doing your dissertation research in. It's important to ask them about their goals and their plans for the lab, and then talk about what sort of lab project you would want to do for your dissertation too, and think about the timeline. I did have a timeline in mind when I started my PhD program. I really wanted to finish it within 4 years. I was very wrong about that, but that's what I wanted. And I told Rusty that I wanted to graduate with my PhD in 4 years. He said that would definitely be possible. And his project had a very good foundation. They already had a lot of good data collected, so I would be able to jump right in and continue that project. I worked in his lab for over a year. And then one day, he called me into his office and told me that he was moving to the University of Virginia. And I had this plan. I had a timeline. I was going to graduate in 4 years, and now all of a sudden that wouldn't be possible. So my choices were either to stay at the University of Rochester, find a new advisor, and start all over again, or move to the University of Virginia with him and be able to continue my current research project. And I still remember that day fresh in my mind. I was very unsure about what to do. But I did go ahead and visit the University of Virginia. I wanted to see what their interpreter services were like, what the environment was like, what accessibility was like there. And I had a nice visit, but the more time I spent there, the more I realized for sure that it was not the right place for me. I really wanted to stay in Rochester. And around the same time, my husband got a job here at RIT, so I didn't feel right moving away from him. And I had my support system here. I had my deaf community in Rochester. There were other PhD students who were deaf at the University of Rochester, and I wanted to stay with them too. At the University of Virginia, I would have been the only deaf person in a PhD program again, and I really didn't want that. So I decided to stay at U of R, start all over again. But again, I thought about Craig Morrell. It had been a year later. I thought maybe he had funding at that point. So I went to his office and asked, and sure enough, he did have funding at that point to be able to accept me. And that was such a relief. So if you remember, my project with Rusty, I did for a year, and then I basically had to start all over again from scratch with Craig Morrell. And for that, I researched the population of lung megakaryocytes. I worked on that project for a year, and it was really difficult. I couldn't get the experiments to work well. It was pretty frustrating. The workflow was also very difficult for me. I was working with mice, and so I had to work pretty fast. It was long hours. It was very strict schedule. There was a lot of processing required, and it was really overall pretty frustrating. I spent about a year working on that project, and then guess what happened? COVID. The COVID pandemic hit. And that really disrupted everything. I mean, for so many people, but myself included, that disrupted a lot of things for me. So my research had to completely stop for 2 months while I stayed at home. And during that time, the U of R recognized that there were some problems with accessibility for deaf people. They were thinking about how to improve it, but they really weren't sure exactly what to do. So they hired a company called Brick Advantage, a consulting company, a deaf consulting company, to come and sort of do a needs analysis, interview us deaf people at the U of R, and find out what needed to be done to improve accessibility for us. Now this was 2015. The U of R had a very small group of deaf people, maybe 10 to 15 people, but now the population of deaf people was growing and there wasn't enough support for us, including deaf students, deaf faculty and staff, deaf PhDs, deaf researchers, many different deaf people in different areas at different levels at the university. So it was nice because I had some downtime at home. I didn't have much to do. I needed to continue doing my research in the lab, but I really couldn't. So, my house couldn't become a biolab. So I focused more on supporting the deaf community at the U of R instead during that time. But at the same time, I was wondering what would happen with my project. Finally, after a few months, the labs opened up again. I was able to get back in the lab, continue doing my research, and I worked on several experiments. There was one in particular that I spent all day working on. And then the next day, I went in and pulled up the data, and the experiment had failed. And I lost it at that point. I felt like I needed to give up. I didn't feel like I could keep going. I had spent a year on this other project, and then my advisor left, and then I spent a year on this project, and my experiments kept failing. I was losing my data. I wanted to graduate in 4 years, and obviously that was completely impossible at that point, so I was feeling very frustrated with myself. And I broke down crying looking at the lost data in my lab. And my advisor came over and asked me what was going on, what was wrong, and I explained it to him. And I have to say that he was such a great PI for me. He was such a great mentor. He really thought hard about how to support me and how to improve the situation for me. So he told me he had a new project for me, and we could do this new project. He already had data for that project. He could make sure that it stayed on track, it wouldn't hold me back anymore than it already had been. And so again, remember my timeline that I wanted to graduate in 4 years. I knew that it would already have to be extended by 2 years because, I like to say that I gained a lot of knowledge, skills, and experience during those 2 years. But really, I do wish that I could have had a smoother journey in my process through my PhD, but my journey is what it is. During the COVID pandemic, again, that really disrupted a lot. That shifted my entire world. And the University of Rochester's response to COVID-19, like many other places, is that they had to let a lot of people go, they had to furlough a lot of people, they had to downsize their staff to save money. And I know that impacted a lot of people in a lot of different areas. For me, I had 2 designated interpreters at the U of R. Both of them were not staff interpreters, they were time as reported. And unfortunately, all of the TAR, time as reported interpreters, were furloughed during that time. Staff were allowed to keep working to support their deaf employees, but unfortunately my designated interpreters could no longer work with me. And I started trying to understand how I could better advocate for myself in that process. I didn't know that I would lose my interpreters until I showed up to work one day and they weren't there. Obviously, after the university had already decided to shut everything down. They did not have a plan for me. When I lost my interpreters, I just didn't have them anymore. I felt very left behind. And of course, there were masks, there was social distancing, and I can get by in the lab by lip reading a little bit, but with masks, obviously that's completely impossible. So I didn't have my designated interpreters, everyone was wearing masks, and it was very, very difficult for me to get through that. So after Brick Advantage finished their analysis, they submitted a full report explaining what the deaf experience was like at the U of R, what improvements could be made to improve their experience. They also hosted a town hall at the end of that year when they submitted the report. U of R decided not to share the full report. They only shared the executive summary of the report. And we were told that we would be able to read the full report, but it was never shared with us. So many of us were upset about that process and upset about the full report being withheld. So we thought if we couldn't get the full report, then we would go ahead and start talking to deaf people at the U of R on our own to learn more about what their experiences were like. And one problem is that deaf people are considered to have disabilities, and so HIPAA prohibits you from disclosing that to other people when deaf people come to the U of R for the first time. So we never know if there's a new deaf employee coming on campus because there's no information shared about with us. There's no deaf space, there's no central place for deaf people to gather, there's no central way for us to keep in touch with each other. So it really grew in a grassroots way through word of mouth. We, found deaf people who knew other deaf people, and we were able to build a network that way. And we talked to each other. And through those conversations, we realized that we all had very different experiences at the U of R. Some of them had plenty of interpreters, some of them struggled to get interpreters at all. Some of them had never experienced any difficulty getting interpreters, and we didn't know exactly what was going on. And again, it would have been very helpful to get that full report, but we never did. And we realized, obviously, that's a lot of work for one person. So I had talked to a few people who also felt very strongly about this and needing to improve the system for deaf people at U of R. And U of R, as well as many other universities, have a system that's not designed to accommodate deaf people. So we wanted to help them to design a system that could include us fully. So I reached out to 2 other people to help me with that. One of them was David Speaker, and the other was Eileen Aldelor. And the 3 of us decided, now that was in March 2022, So that was around the same time as the anniversary of Deaf President Now, the protest at Gallaudet University. So we decided to call it Deaf Leadership Now at the U of R. And to make a long story short, we realized that many of the problems could have been prevented if deaf people were involved at a systematic level in the process. We know that deaf people know best about how to serve other deaf people. We know each other and what we need. But when we explain that to hearing people, sometimes hearing people think they're doing the right thing, but it doesn't actually work for us. But we have to deal with the end result of that process that didn't include us in the first place. So we realized that we needed deaf people in positions of leadership to support the deaf community at the college. And for me, if I have my own individual problem, I need to find a person to be able to help me. I need to explain that problem to this person. And then whatever the problem is, then as that gets passed from person to person, from hearing person to person, the message gets lost. And in the end, I don't end up getting a solution to my problem because the problem is never well understood at the higher levels. So we filed a complaint with the University of Rochester, and through that process, I realized how much time we spent on educating hearing people and why these processes weren't appropriate, why the end result wasn't good, why that was happening, and then solutions to prevent it. And hearing people in positions of power just didn't have that experience. They weren't ready to support deaf people. So that's a huge deaf tax on us. Remember, I was trying to finish my PhD program. I was having a lot of issues with it already, on top of the accessibility issues and the advocacy that I had to take on. So I decided to write an open letter to the University of Rochester, along with a group of people, about 25 people altogether who I had been in touch with. We submitted an open letter to the U of R saying that accessibility is not 100% at the U of R for deaf people. There are gaps in coverage, the statistics aren't being reported correctly, and we submitted this open letter. They responded, and they said we have a 99% coverage rate for accessibility services. And that hurt a lot of us in that process because we know we have those experiences. We do not have 99% coverage rate for our accessibility requests. We recognized that we needed to come together as a deaf community at the U of R, but we weren't sure how to do that. Again, we didn't have a central way to contact each other, and we didn't even have a full list of deaf people on campus. There are a lot of silos at U of R, and so it's difficult to know what deaf people are over here, what deaf people are over there. Do they have the same problems we do, or do they have different problems? But we had to learn how to support each other as deaf people. So we decided to create a community directory where people can get a link to opt into the directory. They can share their name, email, other information, where they work on campus, what their position is. And that helped us a lot. That created a central resource where we could all contact each other. We realized that there were a lot of deaf people that we didn't know about, and we were able to meet other deaf people across campus. It was helpful for us as deaf people to be recognized through that directory. And we also realized that there was no good onboarding process for deaf people. Many deaf people came to campus and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to navigate access services. They didn't know about the support that was in place to help deaf people. So we as other deaf people were able to help them by sharing resources and sharing tips and helping them navigate those systems. And so we were able to identify any new deaf employee could go to the centralized place where they could get resources, they could talk to other people to help them too. So I'm very proud that we were able to set that up. We also hosted several community forums. We invited deaf people, hearing allies, interpreters were all invited to these community forums. And I think we had 4 or 5 community forums throughout this process. We also collected letters of support from NAD, the National Association of the Deaf, California Association of the Deaf, and Gallaudet University. And so really there were 5 things that we asked for from the university. It's hard for me to summarize that entire experience in a short time, but I'll try to be as concise as I can. So through this process, we found out that, first of all, there was no central budget at the University of Rochester. So it was really scattered in terms of who paid for interpreters and how interpreter coverage was provided, and that really harmed deaf people in the end. We wanted a central budget for the entire university, and they did create a central budget. We also realized So at the U of R, there are actually two campuses. One of them is the Medical Center, and the other is called River Campus. It's like two different worlds. It really is. They're completely separate campuses. And the U of R right now is actually really working on creating a more cohesive connection between the two campuses, but they are still pretty separate. So interpreter coverage at the Medical Center was better than that at the River Campus, but there were deaf people working at River Campus who didn't have equal access to interpreters. So we needed to make sure that all deaf people, no matter where they were working, which campus they were working on, had full access to interpreters when they needed them. Third, we wanted a deaf person in a position of leadership who could really support deaf employees and could work with other hearing leaders to educate them, provide guidance on how to solve some of these problems that we were facing. And we needed to include deaf people in that process at every step of the way at a higher level. We asked for these things in 2022, and they did just recently open a position, it closed last week, for a deaf program administrator. We're very excited about that. We also realized that there were many problems with interpreting services and with that department. Many of them were tied to that specific manager at the time, not being supportive enough of deaf people. And so we wanted a deaf manager for interpreting services, a qualified deaf manager. We asked for that, and we did. We do now have a deaf manager of interpreting services, which is very exciting. That person is extremely supportive of us and very understanding of our needs as deaf people. We don't have to spend as much time educating that person on what we need. And it feels very validating to have a person in that position who fully understands what we need. We also asked for the full BRIC Advantage report to be released, and unfortunately that has not happened. Now, one thing through all of my advocacy work, I realized that things move slowly. It takes a lot of patience, but perseverance. And we have to provide support to hearing leadership. We have to develop relationships with them. We started meeting with them regularly. We learned how we can work together, how we as deaf people can work within their hearing systems. And as we explained the issues that we were facing, often they didn't realize that we were facing those issues or how that happened. So we were able to support them and educate them in exchange for them supporting us. It was really a huge learning process for us. So deaf leadership now has contributed greatly to the University of Rochester deaf community to date. We have this opening for deaf leadership. We also have regular meetings with the Vice President of Equity and Inclusion, the Chief Diversity Officer, the Provost, the Associate Vice President of Disability Compliance, and other leaders. And we have this new deaf, very qualified interpreter manager. And we also showed that there is an advantage of having deaf people on campus and that as deaf people, we can accomplish these things. We spearheaded this job opening for the Deaf Equity and Accessibility Program Director. I am very, very excited about that position. And we were able to meet even with the U of R's president to talk about the support that we needed, to talk about growing our pool of interpreters, to talk about scheduling of interpreters and captionists. And we were able to create the Deaf Professional Advisory Council to provide advice and guidance to hearing leadership on how to best make decisions to include deaf people. We also created the Deaf Academic Group that includes clinicians, researchers, and students so that we can gather to talk about our research, talk about our publications, talk about our areas of research that we're doing, and talk about ourselves as deaf professionals. We also presented in 2023 about our work with interpreters and deaf professionals and the dynamics and relationships between them. They are still evolving, and post-secondary education and beyond is important for interpreters to keep up with in their professional field. So with all of that, my project, COVID, Deaf Leadership Now, my advocacy work, you may be wondering what happened to my PhD. I did spend a lot of time and effort on the advocacy work during COVID, and I became very burned out, but I was also very close to finishing. So in my final year, unfortunately, I had my previous advisor Unfortunately, there were several situations that came up that led me to lose my designated interpreters again right before I defended my PhD dissertation. It was so difficult. Those interpreters had worked with me throughout this entire project, and then I lost both of them again. That was extremely difficult. But I'm very fortunate that I was able to borrow 2 interpreters from another deaf professional who I was comfortable with, who was happy to share their interpreter resources with me. I was able to meet with them ahead of time to train them on my science, and I did successfully defend my PhD dissertation. I graduated last May, about a year ago, and I can't believe that it's almost been a year. It still feels like yesterday. So the 3rd time is the charm. I did finish my project, and I researched platelets, IDO1, in malarial infections in mice models. I did a lot of work with mice models. And I can work with mice, but I have to say I really didn't enjoy it that much. So now I am in a postdoc position at the U of R in the Isaac Harris lab. And I'm going back to working with cells again. It was such a long time ago. The last time I worked with cells was in PJ's lab, and she taught me so much about it, but then I never had to use those skills and techniques again until now. So I'm really grateful that I had that experience with PJ to help me with the work that I'm doing now. I'm working on cancer cells and studying novel metabolic changes in cancer cells and how they respond to pharmacological drugs. And then other than that, I'm also working on developing STEM curriculum for interpreters, specifically for post-secondary education and beyond, working with Dr. Kim Kurz and Nikki Cherry here at RIT. I'm very excited about that project. I'm also teaching RSD students through a summer internship program in collaboration with Dr. Wyatt Hall and with the Wilmot Cancer Center at the University of Rochester. And this will be my 4th summer being involved in that program. I'm really excited about that work. I'm also mentoring RIT NTID students in Bridges and URISE and through the alumni program. And I'm also on a committee for the Deaf Rock Conference. I'm very, very excited about it. It's happening again this August, 29th and 30th. The first day is at U of R, the second day is here at RIT, so I hope to see all of you there again. And I will also start teaching here at NTID this fall. So if you see me around, please say hi. And other than that, again, every minute of the day, I continue my advocacy work. I'm still advocating for other areas that need support. There are still many hearing faculty who need to be educated on how to support deaf students. And I'm also working on developing MyPath training for the University of Rochester. For their orientation for deaf employees, for their orientation for hearing employees about how to work with their deaf colleagues at the U of R. And I hope that that will start at the U of R, but then eventually spread across the Rochester community. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you all for listening to my journey. I enjoyed your presentation very much, and you emphasized about working with deaf people, how to increase advocacy and improve advocacy for deaf people, and improving the system to better include deaf people. I know it's not always easy, and recognizing what you need to work on, and then also making sure that you're able to continue doing that work. Having that mindset and that attitude of waking up every day, getting ready to work, getting ready to keep doing that type of work. So how do you develop that mindset, and how did you keep doing it?
Well, someone a long time ago told me that I was a trailblazer for progress. You have to work hard to plow through the obstacles. A deaf person told me something that really stuck with me. That said, we walk so other people can run. And that was very impactful to hear. I want to run too, but I am going to walk and knock down those barriers to make sure that future deaf generations have a better experience. My work is going to help generations to come. And that's what keeps me motivated every day, to ensure that these situations are improved for the future deaf people.